Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Scott. I'm the Executive Director of OASIS, which stands for the Okanagan and Similkameen Invasive Species Society. I'm here today in Summerland in the South Central British Columbia and on the traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx people. And I just wanted to mention that I am on the advisory team for the Northwest Risk and have been so for a couple of years. And it's been really enlightening and great to be part of that partnership. It's almost an expansion of what I'm going to talk about today. I really appreciate working with folks in, of course, across British Columbia, but also into Washington State. And when I started this career path 27 years ago, while there were some good things happening in British Columbia, I really gained so much knowledge and information and so much resource sharing by coming down to the weed coordinator meetings in Washington State. So it's great to continue that dialogue and that ongoing learning process. So today I'm going to talk to you about an initiative that I've been really proud to have been part of since its inception, which has been referred to as the Weeds Cross Borders Project. And as this first slide indicates, it's really about creating a collaborative culture, which I think is critical when it comes to truly addressing the invasive species issue that we're all so concerned and passionate about. So nobody here needs this information. This is pretty clear to all of us, but just kind of to set the scene for how things got started. But we know that invasive species pose a serious threat to both the economy and the biodiversity of our areas. And in particular, this project focuses on the greater Okanagan region in BC and Washington State. And just to make a quick comment, we spell Okanagan all with A's in British Columbia, but Okanagan in Washington, there's an O in there, but just in trying not to have too much text on my slides, but just acknowledging that. We also know that invasive species do not recognize jurisdictional or political boundaries. They freely travel our waterways, our railways, our highways, and other corridors. And then due to urbanization and international trade, the human influence spread of invasive species across borders has just been continuing to increase, especially in recent years. And then added to this, we know that climate change has the potential to exacerbate this spread. Extreme climatic events resulting from climate change, such as floods and droughts, can transport invasive species to new areas. We just heard about that in the last presentation with the tsunami. At a more local level, this is an image of 5 years ago in the region where I'm based, in the Okanagan-Similkameen Regional District, where we had extensive flooding, actually 2 years back to back. And these situations, not only can they transport invasive species to new areas, but they can decrease the resistance of habitats to invasions. Again, we know that invasive species can significantly alter fire regimes, especially in areas that are becoming warmer and drier. And that's the case we have in the interior of British Columbia, as well as areas of Washington State. So throughout the Pacific Northwest, invasive species can increase the frequency and severity of wildfires and puts habitats, urban areas, and human life at risk. And quite another challenging summer that we've faced in the BC interior with wildfires this year. And of course, we had some that crossed the international border. So We were very fortunate that back in 2004, in my abstract, I mistakenly said 2005, but actually nearly 20 years ago, this wonderful lady, maybe some of you in the audience are familiar with Sheila Kennedy, but she had a lot of drive. She has a lot of drive and very passionate lady, and she had the foresight to recognize that we could have so much more effective management if we worked across the international boundaries. And Sheila spearheaded what is now known as the Weeds Cross Borders project back in 2004. At the time, she was the coordinator for the Okanagan County Noxious Weed Control Board. And she understood, as we also did at the time, that interagency and cross-jurisdictional cooperation is really required if you're going to effectively manage invasive species across the varied landscapes. So she reached out to ourselves in the Okanagan Similkameen, our colleagues to the east in the boundary area, as well as Ferry County to the east of Okanagan County. And the four of us, representatives from those four groups, as well as other organizations, came together and established a memorandum of understanding. And the purpose of that MOU was to promote an integrated and coordinated approach to weed management through information exchange, education and training, coordination of inventory and control efforts, as well as sharing of resources. As part of that formation of this group, we established a cooperative weed management area. So we defined the boundaries of the new group. And that's what's shown on this map here. So you can see the four colors representing the four main organizations that were involved. So where Oasis is, we were called the South Okanagan Similkameen Invasive Plant Society at the time, as a lot of names have changed over the last 19 years. So we're the kind of mauve color there. To the east is the what was once called the Boundary Weed Management Committee, now the Boundary Invasive Species Society. Quite a shift in the last 20 years from just targeting invasive plants to species. And then, of course, on the Washington side, in blue is the Okanagan County, and in the peach color is Ferry County. So, 19 years ago, we were fairly confident that we believe this was the first Canada-US cross-borders partnership to be established, focusing on invasive species. And all of us recognize that through the development of this area-wide, coordinated, and cooperative approach to weed management, that we'd be able to more effectively advance the actions necessary to achieve the goals and objective that we all had. So we established this unique team to coordinate work across the US-Canada border. And we were doing this in both directions, so that we could, instead of seeing the border as where we had to end our efforts, we didn't want to see this as a limit. We wanted to see the potential to have that transboundary coordination and cooperation. So the first memorandum of understanding included these four organizations, but it definitely went beyond that. So back in 2004, the MOU also included the British Columbia Ministry of Transportation and the Ministry of Agriculture. It included the Washington State Department of Transportation, and also the Cascade and Columbia River Railroad. And then over the last 19 years, we've had other organizations join forces with us, and we've been able to get resources from many different funding sources. And I won't get into all of them at this time, but it's just been an amazing collaboration of groups on both sides of the border. Of course, when you form a cooperative weed management area, you need to establish a working group. And here is the working group a couple of years into this initiative. And just going through some of the goals or requirements that this group had to focus on. So first and foremost, we needed to develop and maintain criteria for prioritizing species. We can't tackle it all, and as I've mentioned, this really was about invasive plants or weeds right at the start. It has moved into some other species, but largely our focus is on invasive plants. But we needed to prioritize which ones we would focus on collectively. We also needed to develop and maintain an internal communication and education system. But of course, it was all about then moving forward to develop an education and outreach program externally to effectively communicate the issues to the general public. And I think really, you know, back in 2004, there wasn't, we were starting to talk, of course, about climate change, but not necessarily forming those strong linkages to invasive species. We weren't talking about resilient ecosystems as a whole, but it was already starting through this initiative. So one of our strategies that we wanted to promote was truly creating these resilient ecosystems, which we recognized was a key aspect if we were going to be effective in the long term. So the next few slides, I want to really point out one of the key benefits of the formation of this group was to address the challenge of having different legislative requirements and you're bordering each other. So this is something that we addressed right at the get-go. As I mentioned, we developed a priority list of species. And so one of the species here on this screen is Mirabilis, or wild 4 o'clock. And herein lies the problem. So in Washington state, this is a Class A weed. So for anyone not familiar with the classifications in Washington, it's Class A, B, or C, with A being the highest classification. And this is where eradication of Class A plants is required by law. So in British Columbia, we have a few different pieces of legislation, but the most widely applied legislation is the BC Weed Control Act. And under that act, we have a list of invasive plants that are legally required to be controlled, and they are referred to as provincially noxious or regionally noxious. So as you can see here with wild 4 o'clock, no control. Mirabilis was not on any list. So this was pretty concerning to our colleagues in Washington state. So this, in fact, was somewhat of the impetus behind this project. Another species, again, here's where the differing names, what in BC we know as nodding thistle, referred to as musk thistle in Washington. This is a Class B weed. So in this case, there is containment. I'll just summarize it to be more focused on containment. If it's widespread, there isn't necessarily a lot of attention put towards it. If it's fairly limited in its establishment, then more effort. But in British Columbia, again, no, not on any noxious list, and the focus was on biocontrol. And again, it's growing right along the Canada-US border, so another concerning species to our Washington colleagues. And now, kind of flipping it around, we're very concerned about a plant called puncture vine, and in BC, this is has been a regionally noxious species in the regional district where Oasis is located. but this was a Class B, or is a Class B weed in Washington State, and it is quite well established in Okanagan County, so very little attention was being focused on this invasive plant at the time this project was initiated almost 20 years ago. So we were able to work together to come up with this list of species and make decisions on how we could elevate the attention that was focused on these species and make it more consistent across our boundaries. So in addition to that, that involved not only treatment on the ground, but it also involved the education and outreach component, which I mentioned. So I'll just, in the next few slides, I'll go through the positive impacts from this Cross Borders initiative. So outreach was significant. We worked together to develop things like flyers, annual calendars that you can see here. That's our current calendar. Identification booklets, rack cards, bookmarks, posters, and so on. We did a lot of media coverage. And I think the key message here is that we had a lot of consistent messaging, and we really set a positive example of a cooperative relationship. So people really look forward to these cross-border calendars, and the flyers had huge distribution, upwards of 20,000 people on both sides of the border receiving this consistent information year after year. The on-the-ground portion, the inventory and treatment, especially in the first 3 years of the project, we targeted those plants the list we came up with. We did inventory and mapping along all state and provincial highways, as well as key secondary or county roads. We also did inventory on connecting waterways, including Suyas Lake, which is on both sides of the border, and the Kettle River, and also along the border. And that's that photo you see there, that's a crew with the boundary team manually controlling the nodding thistle right along the border. And it was done on the Okanagan County side as well for a number of years to really reduce the outbreaks on that border site. Roadside signage, that was an important part of our initiative in the early days too. Everybody loves that sign on the left there. We can't get away with signs like that in British Columbia, but I have seen international conferences where these signs have made it into people's PowerPoints, but the one on the right, that's one that we have in our region. So throughout the cooperative weed management area, we established roadside signage, and this, I think all of these signs went up in 2008, so 15 years ago, and they're still installed and they're looking great. Legislative tours was another big component, or is a big component of our initiative. A lot of political people from both sides of the border, including US congressmen and senators, Washington state representatives, and from Canada, we had members of the Legislative Assembly from various ministries, mayors, council members, as well as senior staff from various government and non-government organizations. And this was a great opportunity to really raise the level of awareness to our political champions. And this really garnered a lot of ongoing support for our project.
Hi, Lisa. Just want a time check. You got about 30 seconds, maybe.
Perfect. I'll just wrap up. And training opportunities. It not only did this provide training opportunities for the team and our partners, but also external training. And we were able to do some training to customs agents and border patrol for both Canada and the US. And just my last slide, and to wrap up, I just want to say, really, The benefits of cross-border relationships are becoming increasingly more critical with the emergence of new species. We know in the Pacific Northwest, we're highly vulnerable to zebra and quagga mussels, as well as insect pests such as spotted lanternfly. And by creating a collaborative culture with our partners across the border, we're really well positioned to improve on early detection and rapid response. So thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'm so proud of this initiative and look forward to a longer term relationship with folks like you see on this slide. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And there were a couple questions that came in. Number one is how do we get a calendar? But we'll let you answer some of those questions on the chat and just broadcast them to everyone so folks can see. That'd be great. Thanks so much, Lisa. So up next, we have Martina Beck from the British Columbia Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship.
Great, thank you very much, Rachel. And just want to do a check. Can you see my screen?
Yep, looks great.
Excellent, thank you. Well, good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present at this very great lineup that you have at the symposium. And as mentioned, my name is Martina Beck. I'm with the Ministry of British Columbia Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship. And I want to start off by gratefully acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples and that of the Songhees and Esquimalt people here in beautiful Victoria, British Columbia. And so for this morning's presentation, I'm going to start off by talking about a brief overview of our BC Interministry Invasive Species Working Group, which is looking at how we are sort of structured and how we focus our invasive species prevention and management efforts across the provincial government in BC. But then I really wanted to focus the majority of my time talking about work that's been initiated here in BC, looking at how to address and adapt invasive species prevention and management under a changing climate. And in particular, in light of the current and recent unprecedented events that we've had through wildfires and floods and drought, and really looking at, I'll speak to some of the predictive species habitat modeling work that we've initiated, and then looking at how some of this work can help us to inform our managing of invasive species moving forward. And lastly, just touching on some of the resources and reporting tools that we have available. So I wanted to start by just stepping back and talking about British Columbia more broadly. And for those who haven't had the opportunity to come and visit here in BC, we are very fortunate to have an incredibly diverse natural landscape, which ranges from coastal rainforests to interior dry grasslands. And this brings some of the highest biodiversity in Canada. We're also very rich in cultural diversity and history, and there's more than 200 distinct First Nations in BC, each with their own unique traditions and histories. There's more than 30 different First Nation languages and close to 30 dialects that are spoken across the province. And of course, these are really important things that we need to be considering and factoring in as we're looking at invasive species prevention and management. And in particular, when we're looking at such a unique and diverse geographical landscape, it does make it challenging as it can create potential hotspots for new invasive species introductions. And it can make it particularly challenging when we're trying to predict for future changes in invasive species distribution when we're looking across such a diverse geographical landscape, in particular when we're looking at this under a changing climate. So I wanted to just quickly provide an overview of our BC Interministry Invasive Species Working Group. This group was formed back in 2004 with the goal of ensuring that there's a coordinated, collaborative, cost-effective delivery on invasive species programs across the provincial government, across our respective ministries and programs, and really working collectively on science-based activities, things such as strategic planning, robust and harmonized legislation. We also have, in particular for invasive plants, have and run operational and education programs through our own ministry staff, with contractors, other nonprofit organizations and committees, Certainly partnering with groups such as Oasis that we just heard from Lisa Scott, as well as, of course, working with Indigenous communities, as well as consistent reporting practices, amongst other things. And in terms of, the work that we do, certainly we know that managing for invasive species is becoming increasingly complex, and the Interministry Invasive Species Working Group really tries to take that cross-ministry approach. But of course, foundational to all of our work is the collaboration across our different jurisdictions and partners, and working with across local and federal governments, Indigenous nations and bands, also working with our Invasive Species Council of BC, the many regional invasive species organizations across the province, as well as our academic partners and our provincial and state colleagues and partners from neighboring jurisdictions in Canada, US, and beyond. And I really don't have time to go into all the breadth of work, but I did want to just quickly highlight that we do have two subcommittees. We have a Soils and Invasive Species Working Group, and this is really focused on developing some guidelines and best management practices to try to prevent the movement of contaminated soils. And then we also have our Provincial Early Detection Rapid Response Advisory Committee. And central to this committee is taking a science-based risk assessment approach to look at the risks to environmental and socioeconomic impacts of invasive species, and using this to inform our species prioritization and prevention management efforts. And so I'll touch on that as it relates to some of our other work further on. And I just wanted to quickly mention that we do have an invasive species strategic plan. And I just wanted to highlight some of the important changes that we've made recently to update the plan to reflect, first, appropriately address our responsibilities towards reconciliation and shared land management with Indigenous communities, and also the inclusion of climate change projections into our species prioritization and decision making. And that's really where I'm going to be focusing the rest of my talk for this morning. And so when we look at sort of the intersection between climate change and invasive species, as it's already been mentioned already this morning, and we'll certainly be hearing about it more throughout the symposium, is, there's a number of sort of key areas and linkages. Of course, as we see the changes in our climate, we see the change in the potential range and extent and suitable habitat for invasive species. And of course, with that comes changes in their risks of their potential impacts as their ranges and suitable habitats potentially expand. As it was highlighted in Lisa's presentation, certainly here in BC this year and in previous years, but across the globe, we're seeing that increases in frequency and severity of large-scale disturbances. So here in BC this year, we've had an unprecedented historic level wildfire season, and with that, it's not only the disturbance that's caused by the event itself, but equally or more important is the associated disturbances that come with the responses and the post sort of response recovery associated with that could lead to increases in the introduction and spread of invasive species. So whether it's movement of fill in soils as part of recovery and responses, potential movement of, for example, hay when you're bringing that in to address livestock during wildfire responses, or when we're also looking at fire guards. And so really, what some of those potential unintended consequences could be for invasive species spread. And then also the reduction in ecosystem resiliency. Of course, all these factors place more strain on native and invasive species, and what this results in is becoming less resilient to invasive species, and it can reduce the overall ecosystem function and the services associated with that. And so really emphasizing the importance of that prevention, approach of wanting to manage and address invasive species early, as we all know, to help build that ecosystem resiliency and a healthy ecosystem function. Just wanted to quickly touch on some of the work that's been done here in BC relating to some of the sort of post-wildfire and flood response. So over the last sort of decade in particular, as it relates to invasive plants, as we continue to see continued wildfire events and events such as the 2021 extreme atmospheric flood event, we are seeing the need for increase in surveillance of invasive species. In particular, this has been looked at for invasive plants, looking at current occurrences and how to prioritize where further surveillance is done, as well as working with emergency services as part of both the response and the recovery in terms of providing guidelines to help prevent, in particular, for example, invasive plants from being spread, as I mentioned, through potential movement of fill and soil during those responses. But I now want to shift the focus to talk about some of the predictive habitat modeling work that we've initiated here in BC through our Interministry Invasive Species Working Group. And the intent of this work is to help support better management decisions as it relates to integration of climate modeling into our prioritization process. And so we're currently in the first tier or first phase of this work, which is really focused on looking at climate modeling and climate variables. And this work is focused on looking at a combination of both invasive plant and invasive animal species that are either not yet present in BC or present in BC, but in limited extent. And really looking to look at these different climate variables and across different timescales. So ranging from our current timescale up into future timescales all the way to the year 2100 to look at future projections. And what this will do is it'll help us integrate this climate modeling work into our risk assessments, that risk assessment process that I mentioned, and to help with our species prioritization and decision making. And an example of where this can be, really important is for those species that may have been previously assessed and not found to be able to potentially survive and, for example, overwinter in BC. Now reassessing what that could look like under not just current climate projections, but into future in terms of their ability to survive and establish in BC. So really wanting to integrate that into that process. And so in terms of first phase, as I mentioned, the first phase is really focused on looking at the climate modeling side. The process involved looking at a few different modeling approaches. We looked at both a climate BC data model as well as a Koppen-Geiger method. In the end, we chose the climate BC data model. The reason for taking this approach is that the climate BC data uses historic records from the same time periods as the world CLIM data. So what this allowed us to do was do a direct comparison between global data as well as higher resolution BC data and pairing these two together to get a more specific predictive modeling approach. And so with that, it's allowed us to establish some baseline data using both these global and BC data sets across the several time scales that I mentioned. And I mentioned that this is sort of the first phase, first tier, looking at using those 10 climate variables. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into all the specifics of the analysis, but certainly if people are interested, happy to follow up offline with some of those details. And I'll speak to some of the next phases of the work in a few slides, but that will involve integration of habitat variables as well. Just wanted to show some examples of some of the predictive mapping that we've done so far for a few of the priority species. So just to quickly give a bit of an overview what these maps are showing. So this is looking across the 4 time scales that I mentioned. So the top left is the current climate projection time series, and then it's moving through time all the way to the bottom right, which is the most kind of furthest into the future, all the way up to the year 2100 is in the bottom right. So as you move from left to right and down to the bottom, it increases those time periods. And what this is showing is the areas with the highest overlap in the province are considered most likely to be suitable habitats. In this case, we're looking at the example for poison hemlock. And the dark brown represents where there's that highest likelihood of potential suitable habitat. So the more of that dark brown area that you see is that increase in that habitat, suitable habitat, which you can see over the time series. What we have also done currently for the invasive plants is we have overlaid the current distribution. And in this case, that's illustrated by the yellow areas that you can see, which are currently for poison hemlock really limited to the southern parts of the province. And so that data has been overlaid for the invasive plants that we've done, with the intent in the future to integrate that in for the invasive animals that we have done the mapping for. So this being an example of a species that's currently here in BC in more limited extent. And then the next example that I'm showing here is for the spotted lanternfly. Species not yet present in BC, but certainly one that, of course, is on our priority list from a prevent perspective. And again, showing that same time series, the top left being the current climate projections, and then moving further into the future as we get to the bottom right there. And again, those dark brown areas representing where we're seeing higher likelihood of suitable habitat as we move through there. And so I just wanted to quickly touch on some of the next sort of steps or phases of this work. So tier 2 will be starting, work will be starting this winter to start integrating in, I mentioned some habitat variables in addition to the climate variables. And really this is to try to get at some of those more species specific sort of variables. So looking at things like growth limiting factors, elevation, soil type, acidity, of course, aquatic versus terrestrial environments. So really starting to try to bring in some more species specific information in addition to the climate variables. And further into the future, a third tier may include starting to bring in some more site specific level information to really kind of look at if there is some key priority sites that we want to sort of get some more specific information for. That would be likely potential future work as well. And in terms of, how we're going to be looking to use this data for sort of managing moving forward. So as I mentioned, these climate change predictive mapping will be integrated into our provincial risk assessments. This will allow us for us to be able to use these range extension maps to help predict and manage for our priority species. Again, that being a combination of species that are currently in BC, but in limited extent, or those that are potentially on the cusp of being introduced into BC, but maybe have previously been thought not likely to be able to survive or establish, and looking at what that could mean under these different climate scenarios. As I mentioned previously, evaluating the need to protect and build more resilient ecosystems through these sort of extreme climate change related events. And in particular, how that might result in some changes into the species composition, both in terms of changes to our native, but also to invasive species compositions as we experience these different events. And of course, central to this will be, of course, working with Indigenous communities to integrate both traditional knowledge as well as understanding potential impacts to culturally important species. And as well related to, the increase in the large scale events that we're seeing, that training and resources to help support, the response and the recovery associated with those events, and what that looks like from an invasive species kind of lens. And lastly, I just wanted to quickly touch on some of the resources that we have available through our Interministry Invasive Species Working Group website. So we've been working hard to kind of regularly update our species alert sheets that we have available. So we have a number of alert sheets available linked under our priority invasive species page. So you can certainly, I encourage checking that out, as well as we have a 2-hour free online invasive species training program that's available. Really encourage everyone to check that out, and certainly share that across your networks. And we also have the link to our provincial reporting app, which we really encourage everyone to use. You can report both plants and animals through our app, and we always want to see the number of reports increasing. And last year, we had over 2,900 reports submitted through our app. So really great to see that number continue to grow. And I see that I might be getting the time prompt. So I'll leave it there and hopefully allow a bit of time for questions.
Thanks so much, Martina. Just 2 questions for you. One is the link for the BC Prescribed Fire and Invasive Plant Manual. Is that on the website that you just shared?
I'm not sure if it's posted on the website, but I can certainly follow up and get back to you about that.
Cool. And then just one quick question before we move on to next. What habitat variables are you using in the predictive models?
That's a good question. So that work is going to be started this winter. So I think we're still sort of in the process of looking at that. So I don't have all those specifics just yet, but I think there'll likely be a bit of variation depending on certainly between, for example, terrestrial versus aquatic species. But I think we're going to be trying to look at that further this coming winter.
Sounds like we just need to have you back on for a special Northwest Risk webinar in a couple months.
Happy to. Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Martina. And then our last speaker for this session is Elaine Harvey from the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. Elaine, do you want to go ahead and share your screen? Start when you're ready.
Yeah.
Good morning. I'm trying to find my screen, I guess.
Looks great.
Oh, you can see it. All right. Good morning. My name is Elaine Harvey. I am the Watershed Department Manager for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. And today I'll be talking about climate change, invasive species, and application of traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous, or also known as an indigenous knowledge. So some ask and are unsure really what is traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge. And really it is knowledge passed down from the tribal elders and leaders down through generations, through oral traditions, through experience of living on the landscape and having that connection to the landscape, in the different areas where the tribes reside. And for in a tribally, there is known to be coyote legends, from the north all the way up into Canada, all the way to the southwest and to the east. You know, many of the tribes have these coyote legends in the Yakima. In the Yakima way, we call it Spiliai. He is known as the coyote, and through our legend stories and the systems that the coyote and the lessons that is brought through these legends, you know, they're really tied to the landscape. They're tied to why there are mountain peaks, important mountain peaks like Mount Adams, Mount Hood, Wyeth, and Pato. You know, what's the purpose of these geographic areas, and how are these mountains linked to the different the systems of of the glacial systems, and how over time, you know, the snow melts and that water comes down from the tributaries and into one of the Columbia River, you know. And you know, that's one example of a coyote legend. And what, you know, that's just a small example of a coyote story. But really, you know, this is how some of the TEK is passed down, is through legends, through ceremonies, through just living and practicing our traditional ways with our elders. And then another part of traditional ecological knowledge includes the nature and signals that come to us annually. And those include signals from the birds that come in the spring and tell us when the first salmon are going to be coming up the river. And then also there's these small flowers, they're called coyote eyes, and they come about in the early spring after the snow melts. You know, there's a time between when the snow melts and when the first salmon come up, and that's when these little flowers will come up from the creek, along the creeks. and it's a signal to us that our first roots will also be ready in the spring. And so the tribes, we've been here forever, since time immemorial, and we've lived on the land, and through that, we gained a tremendous amount of knowledge about the land, about the resources, about the systems, and and the seasons, and then even how the wildlife and the fish migrate. And just to it's just that's kind of my example and explanation of traditional ecological knowledge. And so how can traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous knowledge be applied um, through management strategies? They could be utilized in forestry management. For one example is prescribed fire, which has been known to many tribal in many tribal communities, where we used fire to manage huckleberry fields, and we used fire to manage root grounds and grazing grounds for the horses at one time. It can also be used for rangeland management, fish and wildlife, habitat restoration, and climate change adaptation planning. And for habitat restoration, I worked in our Yakima fisheries program prior to this position for over 20 years, and I was able to work with our habitat restoration biologists to explain to them the importance of some of these riparian species that we wanted to bring back to our riparian corridors, because a lot of those are medicines and first foods that we utilize, but not only us, but wildlife and the fish. And the tribes have been harvest and land managers since time immemorial. The tribal chiefs and women leaders played an integral role in land management, and they still do today. Our tribal council, they lead our tribes in fishing matters and dealing with the federal and state governments. And the women, in our traditional longhouse homes, they still play an integral role. And they're the women are the ones who are on the landscape. They're the ones who are seeing the changes to the different environments, whether it be in the meadow system, in the high alpine areas where the huckleberries grow, or whether it be in the shrub steppe areas. And as I mentioned before, tribal prescriptive burning has occurred for many generations prior to settlement to our areas. And in this photo, you can see, there isn't that much big trees in the huckleberry fields. These two photos come from the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, where the huckleberries grow. And you see the tribal ladies picking, and then in the lower picture, you see that there was a fire in the huckleberry area. And, that the fire, really does bring back the natural, it helps with the nutrients in the soil, and keeping the huckleberries there. Because now today you go up there and all you see is overgrown fir trees that are competing with the huckleberries and overshadowing them and kind of pushing them out. We are plateau people. We are salmon people. We still continue to gather our foods seasonally. Here's our traditional calendar. I say, we start in the spring and we go all the way through the different seasons and harvest the different fish, the different wildlife, the different roots and berries throughout this year. And then, as it comes to close in the fall and winter, that's kind of the end of our gathering season. But, this is our seasonal calendar. We still continue to go out and we still continue to gather all these different resources out there. So we still have that connection to these different landscapes where these foods are found. And, we believe, and it's kind of carried down through generation to generation and through our, religious practices, that we know that everything is connected on Mother Earth. We know that all of these, our first foods, are connected, from our salmon to our different aquatic species like the Pacific lamprey and the wildlife and the different roots and berries, and even from our mountaintops of our sacred mountains, the Mount Adams, Pato, Mount Rainier, Tahoma, and even Mount Hood, Wyatt. These are all, we know as tribal people that for us to be able to continue on in our ways, we have to keep these intact, these systems intact. I do a lot of exhibitions, first food, explaining, we're still out there, we're still doing what we do, and sharing with our future generations. But everything is connected, and what really connects it is water. Because without water, there is no life. And to us, natural resources are cultural resources. And over the years, since we have that close connection and we still rely upon our natural resources, our roots, our wildlife, our fish, we've been observing and experienced climate change for many years, for, decades. We've seen changes. I've seen changes on the landscape since I was a child to today. And, the fishing, the root and berry harvest seasons are no longer consistent and are a reflection of climate change. And this is by an elder. Her name is Khotasha. So in the Columbia River in 2021, we had the heat wave in June and July. The river got so warm that, the sockeye were dying in Drano Lake, which is from the Little White Salmon River. And, this is a cold water refugia area for fish, but the fish were dying. And some of the sockeye were, they were making their travels up to their spawning grounds. And so we had a salmon vigil. And, this is an example of climate change and an example of hydro systems on the Columbia, but cumulative impacts. But with the fish, having a hard time migrating up the Columbia, what's, more hindrances the invasive species, the aquatic invasive species, and the piscivorous invasive species, as well as the birds and the other mammals that are all invasive to our basin, to this area. Additional threats to tribal cultural resources, the reed canary grass, for example. I worked in a watershed where it was totally choked out with this type of grass, and that really takes the water and chokes out the system, as well as you would have other species such as blackberries that also do the same, and walnuts, and then the tree of heaven. And in regards to our other resources higher in elevation, the huckleberries are getting impacted by the spotted wing Drosophila, which is an invasive species that is attacking our huckleberries in the subalpine areas, but more into the lower elevation. And then in milfoil in the Columbia River, as well as other invasive aquatic species. These are all concerns to us because they all impact our first foods, and as well as the invasive piscivorous fish in the Columbia. And with climate change, where the river is warming, and that's just exacerbating some of these issues, like with the milfoil and the warm water fishes. And then one concern and others, that concern us and everyone else is the possibility, of invasive mussels coming into our system and taking over our streams, totally impact our whole it would impact our whole way of life, because we depend on our stream systems for many cultural resources, which in aquatic cultural resources, which include the Pacific lamprey, the suckers, whitefish, salmon, different salmon, and steelhead. So, these are just some of the threats that we have concern over. And then, and how are the tribes, taking steps towards climate resilience. And the Yakama Nation and the Nez Perce and other tribes I know are working on, or they have completed their climate adaptation plan. And in many of these plans, invasive species are included, so that, that, because it over time, and with climate warming, they will impact many of the tribal resources. One example that the Yakama Nation is doing is promoting, bringing back the beaver into the different watersheds, relocated nuisance beavers. In our language, they have a name. They're called wishbush, and they have a natural. They're natural to the systems, and they've been removed, and what we are promoting is bringing beaver back into the watersheds. And in our, as I mentioned earlier, in the coyote legendary stories, that was his purpose. The beaver had a purpose on the landscape, and that was to create dams to retain water in the higher watersheds. So that's kind of an example of how TEK is linked through our legends and our stories and our religions, down to how it can be linked to management strategies. I mentioned this a little bit ago, the invasive spotted ring Drosophila, which has been, impacting the huckleberries since around 2010. There were studies in 2014, and with the Yakama Nation and others really pushing the Forest Service to, get a handle on the distribution of these, and also, how could the forest be managed so that we can protect the huckleberries, which is really one of our main first foods that we gather, and it's really important and integral to the Columbia Plateau tribes. And so, and also, we've been working with the Forest Service more. I've been working personally more with the Gifford Pinchot National Forest on restoration of huckleberry habitat. We're looking at, we've already done some tree thinning, burning, different types of burning after thinning, burning after logging, and just burning, and watching the monitoring what is happening after these restoration, different scenarios. So we are, attempting to bring back fire to the landscape. And I wanted to share this slide, since this is an invasive species workshop, that many of the tribes, Yakama, Warm Springs, Nez Perce, Umatilla, we gather our foods in many different areas. We gather them in, shrub steppe areas. We gather them in forested areas, meadows, systems, and there's a lack of awareness that people have, counties, state, federal agencies, that we still gather our foods here. And I just feel like there should be outreach to the tribes of areas where they spray herbicides and other chemicals, because we're out gathering these foods. And, it's kind of a mission of mine personally to get out into our areas where Yakama people go out and gather, you know, just to get awareness, because we are getting poisoned by by herbicidal use. And, you know, the tribes, you know, we have vested interests in all our ancestral lands and resources because, you know, we've been here forever, as far as we've known, time immemorial, and we don't plan on leaving. We plan to stay here. We plan, you know, for our future generations, our children, to continue on fishing, hunting, gathering the roots, berries, and, you know, the different resources out here. So, you know, we have the vested interest in you know, to protect and enhance and conserve these our lands and resources for all generations. And and I believe, you know, working with tribes and with the different tribes, you know, there are many tribes in our region that could be approached, that could, you know, be contacted for consultation. And there are different cultural practices, and you know, I think one in that's coming about more is the use of fire in the landscape, because you know the Yakimas used fire for huckleberry restoration, or bringing back the huckleberries, and to keep the fir trees down, and also I think the tribes have their own invasive species management plans, and those are, I think, more on reservation, but could be applied off reservation. And I just wanted to explain and you know, just bring that awareness out again, because I think it's important, because I work with Nature Conservancy and different land trusts that are, you know, opening their lands for tribal access for root gathering, berry gathering, and medicine gathering. But, you know, I asked them, well, what have you done? You know, are you guys spraying this area? And they said yes. So I was like, well, you know, that kind of excludes us because we don't want to poison our relatives, because we really gather the roots, or we're gathering the leaves, or, you know, the different parts of the plants. And so, you know, doing that, spraying herbicides are there, you know, I wish could be used more cautiously. I've done a restoration project in a watershed I worked in about 10 years ago. It was a big wetland, and it was in, you know, the blackberry bushes just took over the whole wetland, and it was about 12 feet high. We burned it, and eventually, after the burning, the blackberries, you know, were burnt. And this was done in early spring. Later spring and summer, the wetland practically restored itself. I didn't have to do like intensive planning or anything. It's like the wetland plants, seeds that were still in there and under all those blackberries sprouted back out, you know, had all the wetland plants. And, you know, after the burning, um, we just kept on the site to, you know, try to keep any invasive species from re-encroaching the area. But that was a real beautiful thing to experience, is just the use of fire. And, you know, there's other methods like using goats, or different organic methods, I believe, of invasive weed plant removal. But, you know, I just wanted to share that story, and I didn't have pictures on my computer of that restoration project on this computer I wanted to share with you all, but kind of just envision, like, you know, this wetland that was totally overgrown with blackberries. And after the fire, you know, it all came up, all the wetland plants, you know, they just sprouted out naturally. And also, I'll just share another story of the Yakima Nation's wetland over near Toppenish. You know, they restored the wetland. It was dried out for farming. So they restored a wetland, and after they restored that wetland, these traditional plants called wapato came back naturally. The seeds were down there, the wetland was restored, and the seeds, sprouted out, and now we have Wapato back in Toppenish. But that since the loss of wetlands, we lost, that traditional plant called Wapato for many years, and so it was a good at least 60 years or more where we were able to gather the Wapato and bring it back into our ceremonies and our traditional homes. But I wanted to, I think that's the end of my presentation. I don't know if there is any questions.
You know what, we did actually had quite a bit of feedback during your session, but because we have another session starting at 11, we did just have a quick discussion. I think what we'll do is we'll collect the questions that came in for your talk and for some of the other sessions, and we'll give the speakers time to answer those over text, and then we can send those out. But thank you so much, Elaine. You got a lot of positive responses, and you can maybe even see the reactions right now with a lot of the stories you're able to tell. Thank you so much for your time.